the emergency council chamber of the Calrathi. Confederation blazed with holographic displays showing only red markers across 17 star systems, and every red marker represented a world already lost to the Vrexian swarm or a world currently under siege. And dying Elder Vracum stood before the assembled representatives of 17 species, and his 4 arms trembled as he gestured toward the tactical display where crimson infections spread like disease across their territory, and in 2 years they had lost 70% of their worlds and 12 billion souls to an enemy that did not negotiate and did not tire and did not stop consuming. We have sent 43 requests for aid to the Ascendancy, Vracum said, and his voice cracked with exhaustion that came from months without proper rest, and the fear that came from watching his civilization die slowly and knowing he could do nothing to stop it. They responded with sympathy and refusal. A Kelthoran diplomat whose scales had dulled from stress tapped her clawed fingers against the council table and spoke in the clicking language that translator implants converted to common speech. The trade guilds offered to evacuate our leadership for a price we cannot afford, and the crystalline choir sent philosophical texts about accepting the cycle of existence. Cowards, hissed Ambassador Thrinks, and his insectoid features twisted with rage. They watch us burn because intervention might threaten their precious neutrality. The holographic display shifted to show the most recent battle footage from the Kelmar system, where Verxian bioships swarmed like locusts around the defense platforms in each enemy vessel pulsed with organic weaponry that fired living ammunition which burrowed into hulls and consumed ships from within, and the Confederation fleet fought bravely and died uselessly against an enemy that replaced every loss within days by breeding new ships from harvested biomass. Vracum watched the Kelmar Defense Coordinator's final transmission as Vexian boarding organisms flooded his command center, and the coordinator kept broadcasting tactical data even as the creatures tore him apart, because he knew every second of information might save another world and might buy another day. And then the transmission ended in static, and Kelmar fell silent and became another red marker on a map that showed nothing but defeat. "We have one option remaining," said Chief Strategist Pelna, and she was young for her position because everyone senior to her had died in the war's first year, when the Confederation still believed they could win through conventional warfare. "There is a region of space that all galactic powers have marked as restricted territory, and it is listed in navigation charts as Quarantine Zone Terra." The council chamber fell silent except for the soft humming of holographic projectors and the distant vibration of the station's engines. And 17 species, who had spent 10,000 years building a civilization based on cooperation and peaceful coexistence, looked at each other with the desperate hope of the dying. The humans whispered Elder Morith, and his species kept the longest historical records in the Confederation, and those records contained fragments of stories from before the quarantine. The warnings say they are dangerous. Pelna nodded and brought up ancient text files recovered from derelict observation posts near the quarantine boundary, and the files spoke of a species that had split atoms to destroy their own cities and engineered plagues that killed millions of their own kind and fought wars so total that they had names for different types of extinction-level conflict. And the galactic community had watched in horror as humans nearly made their world uninhabitable through sheer violence, and then the humans had gone silent and imposed their own quarantine.
Ow.
And no one had heard from them in 300 years. Dangerous. Yes, Pelna agreed. But the historical records also show that humans never lost a war they fully committed to, and that human soldiers fought with a ferocity that made other species flee in terror, and that human tactics involve weapons and strategies other civilizations considered impossible or insane. Ambassador Thranks leaned forward, and his compound eyes reflected the red markers of dying worlds. "You propose we wake a monster to fight a monster. I propose we send a message to the only species that might actually come," Pelna said, and her voice carried the weight of someone who had already made peace with terrible decisions. "Because in 6 months the Vrexian swarm will reach our core worlds, and in 1 year the Calarathi Confederation will exist only in historical archives." The vote took 3 hours of debate, but desperation won over caution, as it always does when extinction looms close enough to smell, and the council authorized transmission of a broad-spectrum distress call. toward quarantine zone. Terra using every frequency and every encryption standard known to galactic civilization. The message was simple and honest, because the Confederation had nothing left to bargain with, except truth. We are dying, and no one will help us, and we ask humanity for aid against an enemy we cannot defeat alone, and we offer whatever payment you require if you will come. For 6 days they received no response, and during those 6 days, 3 more worlds fell, and the Vrexian swarm pushed deeper into Confederation space and consumed everything living, and converted it into more ships and more weapons and more soldiers. The 7th day a transmission arrived from the quarantine zone, and it was not the diplomatic overture they expected or the request for negotiation they had prepared for, and instead it was 15 words in flat, emotionless human standard language. Coordinates received in fleet and route, and estimate arrival in 42 hours. The council chamber erupted in celebration, and relief flooded through the Confederation as news spread that someone had finally answered their desperate call and that help was coming, that maybe they would survive after all. But Elder Morith did not celebrate. Instead, he went to the restricted archives, where the oldest warnings were kept, and he read files that other species had compiled about humanity before the quarantine, and he read about wars that lasted years and killed millions over resources, or ideology, or ancient hatred, and he read about human weapons that poisoned worlds and human tactics that involved acceptable losses, measured in billions, and human philosophy that said survival justified any action and any cost. He read about the human-Akrelian War, where humanity had faced a superior enemy and responded by developing biological weapons that targeted Akrelian neural chemistry specifically, and how humans had deployed those weapons without hesitation and without mercy, until the Akrelians sued for peace and accepted any terms humanity demanded. He read about human civil wars where factions had bombed their own cities, rather than let them fall to enemies, and where soldiers had fought building to building through radioactive ruins because surrender was never considered an option worth discussing. He read psychological profiles compiled by xenologists who had studied humanity from a distance, and every profile emphasized the same traits again and again. Persistence that bordered on insanity, and aggression that seemed hardwired into their genetics, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat was the only logical outcome. Morith closed the files and looked at the DE. Celebration continuing in the council chamber below his observation deck, and he wondered if they understood what they had done, and whether the Confederation would survive the cure as well as the disease 42. Hours later, the human fleet arrived at the edge of Confederation space, and their ships did not look like the sleek vessels of civilized navies, but like weapons worn from use and marked scars and painted with symbols that spoke of violence and death and victory. The lead ship transmitted a simple message. To the Confederation Command, this is Admiral Chen of the Human Expeditionary Fleet, and we are here to solve your Vrexian problem and recommend all civilian vessels maintain minimum safe distance from combat operations. Elder Vreckham tried to send a formal greeting and a request for strategic coordination, but the human fleet was already moving and accelerating toward the nearest Brexian position with the kind of speed that suggested they had been planning this attack during their entire journey. The Confederation had called for help, and help had come, but Morith knew from his reading that humanity did not think in terms of rescue or salvation, and instead they thought in terms of threat elimination and acceptable casualties, and a total war. The monster had awakened, and now it would feed. The human fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel in a formation that made Confederation military analysts pause their celebration and stare at their tactical displays with growing unease, because the ships did not arrange themselves in the stations, did not arrange themselves in the defensive spheres or diplomatic lines that civilized navies used, but instead formed a pattern that spoke only of attack. Admiral Vrackham stood on the observation deck of the Confederation flagship Harmonious Dawn and watched through the massive viewport as human dreadnoughts took position, and each vessel was massive and angular and covered in armor plating that showed scarring from weapons fire and impacts in each hull carried. Markings that translator software identified as battle, honors, and kill counts. They have names painted on their ships, said Commander. Helrix in her voice carried a mixture of confusion and growing horror. The lead dreadnought is called Unbroken Will, and the carrier group flagship is Righteous Fury. And there is a destroyer marked with the name. Necessary Evil Vracum tried to establish communication protocol with the human fleet commander, but before he could finish composing a formal greeting, Admiral Chun's face appeared on the main display, and she looked nothing like the diplomatic envoys who usually conducted first contact, and instead, she looked like someone who had spent decades in combat and expected to spend decades more coons. Face was marked with scars that ran across her. Left cheek and her eyes held the kind of exhaustion that came not from lack of sleep but from seeing too much death and causing too much of it herself. And she wore a uniform that was clean but showed signs of frequent repair and long use. Admiral Vracum of the Calrathi Confederation, Chen said, and her voice was flat and emotionless like someone reading coordinates. Instead of conducting first contact with an alien species, we received your distress call regarding Vrexian infestation. Your territory, and we are here to eliminate that infestation. Vracum noticed she used the word infestation rather than invasion or occupation, and he noticed. She said eliminate rather than repel or defeat, and the word choices made his scales itch. With instinctive warning, Admiral Chen, we are grateful for your response to our plea for assistance. Vracum began, and he was trying to follow proper diplomatic protocol, even though Chun's expression suggested she had no patience for such things. We hoped to coordinate our forces and develop a joint strategy for pushing back the Phyrexian advance. We don't need coordination, Chen interrupted, and her eyes moved to something off-screen, and Vracum realized she was already reviewing tactical data about Phyrexian positions. We need you to stay out of our operational area and recover your own wounded and salvage your own ships and leave the killing to us. The observation deck fell silent, and 17 species who had built their civilization on consensus and cooperation tried to process what they were hearing and failed because Chen spoke about killing the way others spoke about mining operations or construction projects. Admiral, we have been fighting the Vrexians for 2 years, Helrix said, and her diplomatic training reasserted itself, even though her claws were extended in subconscious threat display. We have tactical intelligence and strategic assessments that could you have been losing for 2 years, Chen said, and she finally looked directly at them through the view screen, and her gaze was cold and analytical. You have lost 70% of your territory because you fight like civilized beings, and the Vrexians are not civilized, and they do not care about your rules of engagement or your ethical guidelines, and they will consume every world you have unless someone stops them. Permanently, Vracum felt his primary heart skip as Chen leaned forward and her scarred face filled the screen. We stopped asking permission to do what was necessary a long time ago, and we are not here to save you, and we are not here because we care about your confederation or your 17 species, and we are here because the Vrexians violated our quarantine boundary 10 years ago and killed a human research station, and we have been preparing to exterminate them ever since. The word exterminate hung in the air like poison, and Vracum understood with sudden terrible clarity that the Confederation had not summoned allies but had instead released something that frightened them almost as much as the Vrexians did. You want revenge, Vracum said quietly. We want threat elimination. Chen corrected. Revenge is emotional, and we learned centuries ago that emotion makes you sloppy and gets your people killed, and we prefer our enemies dead and our people alive before Vracum could respond. The human fleet began moving in tactical displays, dreadnoughts accelerating toward the nearest Vrexian siege formation with a speed that seemed reckless and suicidal, and the Confederation had tried that kind of direct assault in the war's first months and lost entire fleets. They will be slaughtered, Helrix whispered. The Vrexian defensive formations. We'll shred them before they get within effective weapons range. But the humans did not follow any attack pattern the Confederation recognized, and instead of approaching in formation, they scattered in individual ships, began erratic maneuvers that made targeting solutions impossible, and then they opened fire at ranges the Confederation had never considered viable. Weapons were different and wrong in ways that made Confederation gunners stare in disbelief, because instead of energy beams or conventional missiles, the humans fired projectiles that moved at relativistic speeds and created impact craters visible from orbit, and they launched swarms of autonomous drones that flew kamikaze patterns into Vrexian bioships and detonated. With yield that suggested nuclear cores, the Vexian siege fleet that had held Confederation forces at bay for 8 months tried to respond, but human electronic warfare systems scrambled their organic neural networks and human cyber attack programs, infected their biological computers, and the Vrexians found themselves blind and deaf. And dying, they are not fighting, said a Keltheran, tactical observer, and his voice shook with something between awe and revulsion.
Oh.
They are butchering human marines. Launched boarding pods toward Vrexian capital ships, and the pods punched through organic holes with shaped charges, and then the marines emerged wearing armor that made them look like mechanical demons, and they carried weapons that fired rounds. Designed to fragment inside bodies, and they moved through Vrexian ships with methodical efficiency and killed everything living. Wreckham watched the helmet camera feeds that human forces broadcast on open channels like psychological warfare, and he watched human soldiers clear corridor after corridor and chamber after chamber, and they did not hesitate when they found Vrexian young inbreeding pods, and they did not pause when they encountered unarmed worker forms, and they simply killed everything and moved to the next section. This is a war crime, Helric said, and her voice was hollow. By every convention of civilized warfare, this is genocide. This is pest control, said Chen's voice over the communications channel, and she had apparently been monitoring their reactions. You called us because you were losing, and now we are winning. And if you do not have the stomach to watch, then turn off the feeds and wait for the results. The battle lasted 16 hours, and when it ended, the Vrexian siege fleet was debris and biological matter floating in vacuum, and human ships were already moving toward the next target, and their hulls showed fresh damage, but their formations remained intact, and their kill counts had increased. The Confederation had lost 40 ships and 2,000 personnel trying to break that siege.
Ow.
Over 8 months, and the humans had lost 3 destroyers and approximately 600 marines, and they had won completely and without hesitation. Admiral Chen contacted Vrockham again, and her face showed no triumph or satisfaction, but only tired professionalism. We are proceeding to Grid 77 Alpha, where your intelligence indicates another vaccine formation, and recommend you begin recovery operations for any survivors from the siege and salvage. What you can from the wreckage, Admiral, Vrockham said, and he was not sure what he wanted to ask, but he knew he needed to understand what he was seeing. The Vrexians you killed and the biological matter you are leaving behind, and should we not? Our science teams are already collecting samples, Chen said. We will analyze their genetics and their weapons and their shipbuilding processes, and we will use that information to kill them more efficiently at the next engagement, and suggest you do the same if you want to survive after we leave the transmission ended. And the human fleet accelerated away toward the next battle, and Vrockham stood in the observation deck and watched his people celebrate their first major victory in 2 years, and he wondered what price they would ultimately pay for this salvation, because the humans had not come to rescue the Confederation, and they had not come to restore peace, and they had come to kill an enemy, and they would teach the Confederation to kill as well. And Vrockham knew from reading the ancient histories that humans were very good teachers when it came to making war. The monster was feeding, and the Confederation was learning to feed alongside it. 3 months into the human campaign against the Vrexian swarm, and the Confederation had reclaimed 18 worlds, but none of those who had lived through the liberation felt like celebrating, because they had seen what human liberation actually meant. Commander Pelna stood in what remained of the city of Vex on the planet. Kelmara, and she wore a breathing mask because the air still carried traces of chemical weapons that human forces had deployed to clear Vrexian biostructures from underground tunnel networks, and all around her, the city was silent, except for the sound of wind moving through empty buildings. The Vrexians had occupied Kelmara for 7 months, and had converted approximately 40% of the population into biomass for their war machine, and had turned another 30% into enslaved workers, whose neural systems were overridden by Vrexian control organisms, and the remaining 30% had hidden in whatever spaces they could find and waited for. Rescue human forces had arrived 6 days ago and had assessed the situation with cold efficiency and had determined that separating enslaved Kelmaron from their control organisms was not tactically viable given time constraints and resource allocation. And so they had simply killed everyone who showed signs of Rexian infection, whether those people begged for mercy or no. Pelna had watched from orbit as human soldiers executed thousands of Kelmaran, who might have been saved with time and medical intervention, but time was a luxury the humans refused to waste, and medical intervention was a resource they allocated only to those who could return to combat. Effectiveness quickly, this is murder. Pelna had transmitted to Colonel Marquez, who commanded the human ground forces, and her voice had been raw with rage and grief. Marquez had responded with the same flat, emotionless tone that all human military personnel seemed to use. This is triage, and we have limited medical capacity, and the Vrexian control organisms cannot be safely removed in field conditions, and leaving infected individuals alive creates security risks and operational complications. These are people, Pelna had shouted. They are civilians who were enslaved through no fault of their own, and you are executing them like animals. They are casualties, Marquez had corrected. And yes, we are killing them quickly rather than leaving them to die slowly when their control organisms fail, or when the Vrexians detonate them remotely as booby traps. And if you have a better solution that does not compromise operational security, then please share it. Pelna had no better solution, and that was what haunted her as she walked through the empty streets of Vex and saw the burn marks where human flamethrower units had cleared Vrexian organic growths from building facades, and saw the bodies that human forces had left stacked in designated collection areas for eventual cremation. The humans had liberated Kelmara from Vrexian occupation, but the liberation had cost almost as many lives as the occupation itself, and now the survivors huddled in refugee centers and looked at their human saviors with expressions that mixed gratitude with terror. Pelna entered the command center that human engineering teams had established in the former planetary government building and found Marquez reviewing tactical displays that showed Vrexian positions across the sector, and the colonel looked up as Pelna approached, and her scarred face showed no sign of guilt or doubt. Commander Pelna, Marquez said, "We are preparing to move on the Vrexian breeding facility on Kelmara's southern continent and recommend your forces remain at minimum safe distance." During the operation, what kind of operation? Pelna asked, and she was tired of asking, but she kept asking anyway, because someone needed to bear witness to what was happening. Sterilization, Marquez said simply. The facility produces approximately 50,000 Vrexian soldier forms per standard month, and removing it from their logistics chain will significantly impact their ability to replace combat losses. Pelna pulled up the intelligence data on the breeding facility and felt her stomach twist, because the facility was not just a military installation but also housed millions of Vrexian young in various stages of development. And those young were not soldiers but the next generation of Vrexian civilians and workers, and yes, some would eventually become warriors, but most would become the farmers and builders and all the other roles that any civilization needed. You are going to kill children, Pelna said, and she made it a statement rather than a question because she already knew the answer. We are going to eliminate future enemy combatants, Marquez said, and yes, that includes immature Vrexians who will reach combat readiness in 2 to 5 years, and the Vrexian life cycle does not distinguish between civilian and military roles, and their entire species exists as a war machine, and you cannot negotiate with them, or reform them, or convince them to choose peace. So your solution is genocide. Our solution is species-level threat elimination, Marquez said, and for the first time her voice carried a hint of emotion, and it sounded like weariness rather than anger. The Vrexian swarm has consumed 47 intelligent species in the past 2,000 years and turned their worlds into breeding grounds and weapons factories, and every time another civilization tried to negotiate or show mercy or fight a limited war, the Vrexians adapted and consumed them. Marquez pulled up historical files that showed worlds the Vrexians had taken, and Pelna saw cities that looked like her own reduced to organic matter and populations that numbered in billions reduced to nutrient paste, and she saw that the Vrexians did not conquer or occupy, but simply consumed. We learned a long time ago that some enemies cannot be defeated through conventional warfare. Marquez continued, they can only be destroyed completely and utterly until they lack the capacity to threaten anyone ever again. And yes, that is harsh. And yes, that violates every ethical guideline your Confederation holds sacred, but your ethics were not saving you, and our ruthlessness is the human strike on the breeding facility happened 3 hours later, and Pelna watched from orbit as tactical nuclear weapons turned the entire southern continent into radioactive glass and killed everything living within a 1,000-kilometer radius, and somewhere in that inferno, millions of Vrexian young died without ever knowing why. The Confederation Council called an emergency session to debate whether they should ask the humans to leave despite the fact that the humans were winning battles the Confederation had considered unwinnable and elder. Vacuum presided over arguments that split along predictable lines. They are monsters. Declared Ambassador Thrinks they kill without hesitation or mercy, and they use weapons we banned centuries ago. It's too horrible for civilized warfare. And if we allow them to continue, then we become complicit in their crimes. They are effective. Countered Strategic Director Kelmouth, in 3 months, they have reclaimed more territory than we lost in the previous year. Manned Vrexian advance has stopped and begun reversing, and our casualties have dropped by 70% because human forces absorb the worst combat at what cost to our souls. Thrinks demanded we built our Confederation on principles of cooperation and peaceful coexistence and respect for all sentient life and the humans. Spit on those principles with every action. They take the Vrexians already destroyed those principles, Kelmoth said quietly. They consumed our people and turned them into weapons, and they would have consumed every world we have if we had insisted on fighting by rules they do not acknowledge or respect. The debate continued for hours but ended as Pelna had known it would, because desperation always won over idealism when extinction was the alternative, and the Council voted to allow human operations to continue with the understanding that the Confederation forces would not participate in actions they deemed war crimes, but participation was becoming harder to avoid, because human commanders had begun offering training programs for Confederation military personnel, and those programs taught tactics and strategies that the Confederation had never considered in weapons. Proficiency with equipment that violated their traditional rules of engagement. Telna watched young Kelmaron soldiers return from human training facilities, and she barely recognized them because they moved differently and spoke differently and looked at the world with the same cold calculation. She saw in human eyes they practiced room-clearing techniques that emphasized speed and violence over the careful precision the Confederation taught, and they learned to use human weapons that fired ammunition designed to cause maximum tissue damage. And they studied human tactical philosophy that treated acceptable losses as inevitable rather than tragic. We are teaching them to be like us, Marquez said, when Pelna confronted her about the changes she was seeing in Confederation forces. Because being like you was getting them killed, and being like us keeps them alive long enough to win. You are destroying who we are, Pelna said. You are becoming who you need to be to survive. Marquez corrected, and when this war ends, you can decide whether you want to stay that way or try to return to what you were, but you cannot make that choice if you are dead.
Oh no.
Had no answer, because Marquez was right, and that was the most terrible part of all of this. And the Confederation was surviving, but the price of survival was becoming. The Vrexian overmind had consumed 47 species across 2,000 years of expansion and had incorporated their genetics and technology and survival strategies into its collective consciousness, and it had never encountered a species that fought the way humans fought deep within the organic core world that served as the overmind's central processing nexus. Millions of neural clusters analyzed tactical data from the human campaign, and every analysis reached the same conclusion. And humans did not fight to win territory or resources, but fought to eliminate threats permanently and completely. The overmind reviewed battle recordings, where human forces had bypassed valuable facilities to destroy breeding centers, and had ignored strategic positions to sterilize Vrexian population hubs, and had sacrificed tactical advantages to ensure complete elimination of Vrexian presence. And the pattern was clear and unprecedented and deeply troubling every other species. The swarm had fought, eventually sued for peace or accepted territorial compromises or withdrew to defensive positions. But humans kept advancing and kept killing and showed no interest in negotiation or coexistence, and they treated the war not as a conflict but as an extermination campaign. The Overmind made a decision that would have seemed like desperation in a species capable of such emotion, but which was simply logical resource reallocation, and it began redirecting primary battle fleets away from Confederation territory and toward the quarantine zone where humans had originated. And if humans would not accept peace, then they would be consumed like every other threat admiral. Chen stood in the command center of the Unbroken and watched tactical displays update with new Vrexian fleet movements, and she smiled for the first time since the campaign had begun. Because the enemy was doing exactly what human strategic planning had predicted they would do, they are going after Earth, said Commander Okoye, and his voice carried concern that Chen did not share. They are going after where they think Earth is, Chen corrected. And they will find nothing but automated defense platforms and radiation signatures from a planet we abandoned 300 years ago. The human species had learned during their own civil wars that homeworlds were strategic vulnerabilities and emotional attachments that enemies could exploit, and so they had done what no other species had considered, and they had evacuated their entire population to mobile habitats and orbital stations and generation ships that moved constantly through. Space Earth still existed but held only automated systems and historical preservation sites. And the occasional research team, and if the Vrexians wanted to glass a planet that humans no longer needed, then they were welcome to waste resources doing. So redirect Fleet Group Zeta to intercept Vrexian Battlefleet 7, Chen ordered, and prepare Gamma-level engagement protocols. Okoye hesitated because Gamma protocols were the tactics humans had developed during their darkest wars and had promised themselves they would use only against existential threats, and the protocols included weapons that made tactical nuclear strikes look gentle, Admiral. Those protocols, Okoye began, are exactly what we need to break the Overmind's ability to coordinate fleet actions, Chen interrupted. The Vrexians operate through hive-mind consensus, and their capital ships contain neural relay nodes that process battlefield data and distribute commands, and if we can disrupt those relays, then we turn their strength into weakness. The human fleet group Zeta moved to intercept in their ships, carried weapons that other species had banned as too psychologically devastating for warfare, and Chen had no such restrictions because humans had used every weapon imaginable against themselves, and had emerged with a very different understanding of what constituted acceptable force. The battle began at long range with conventional weapons and missiles and energy beams, and the Vrexians responded with tactics that had worked against every other species they had fought, and they used superior numbers and biological regeneration and swarm tactics that overwhelmed defensive systems then. The humans deployed psychological warfare protocols, and Confederation forces who were monitoring the engagement did not understand what they were seeing, because human ships began broadcasting audio recordings of Vrexian queenforms dying, and those recordings had been captured during previous battles and enhanced with frequency analysis to maximize their impact on Vrexian neurochemistry. The effect was immediate and devastating because Vrexian bioships were grown rather than built and retained instinctive responses to distress calls from their queens, and hearing those calls triggered genetic programming that made them prioritize rescue over combat, and their formations began breaking apart as individual ships tried to locate the source of the Queen Scream. Schumann forces pressed the advantage with weapons specifically designed to exploit Vrexian biology, and they deployed aerosol compounds that mimicked Vrexian attack pheromones and caused bioships to identify each other as threats and begin firing on their own forces, and they used directed energy weapons tuned to frequencies that caused pain in Vrexian neural tissue. This is not warfare, transmitted Elder Vracum from the Confederation observation vessel. This is torture. This is efficient threat elimination, Chen responded. And the Vrexians would do worse if they had the capability, and did do worse to the species. They consumed before we arrived. The Vrexian fleet tried to maintain cohesion, but human electronic warfare teams had spent months analyzing captured Vrexian biocomputers, and now they deployed malware specifically engineered to infect organic neural networks, and the malware spread from ship to ship through the same hive mind connections that normally gave Vrexians tactical superiority. Infected bioships began receiving false commands and attacking designated allies and redirecting two phantom targets, and their crews could not understand why their ships were betraying them, because the infection operated below their conscious awareness and rewrote their perceptions of reality. The battle that should have been a Vrexian victory, based on numbers and firepower, instead became a rout because humans had weaponized the swarm's own strengths against them and turned their hive mind into a liability and their biological weapons into vulnerabilities. But the humans were not satisfied with victory, and once the Vrexian fleet was scattered, they began boarding operations, and Confederation observers watched in horror as human special forces teams captured Vrexian bioships and extracted living Vrexian commanders and brought them aboard human vessels for interrogation. "They are taking prisoners," said Commander Pelna, and her voice carried hope that perhaps humans were capable of mercy after all. "They are taking intelligence assets," corrected Colonel Marquez, who had joined the Confederation observation team, "and once we extract everything useful from their neural tissue, we will dispose of them and use what we learned to kill more efficiently." Pelna watched as human science teams performed procedures on captured Vexians that would have violated every medical ethics guideline in Confederation law, and the humans showed no hesitation as they dissected living specimens and mapped their neural pathways and identified the biological mechanisms that allowed hive mind communication. "You are monsters," Pelna said quietly. "We are survivors," Marquez said, "and we learned a long time ago that you cannot afford mercy toward an enemy that will use that mercy to kill you, and the Vrexians have proven they deserve none." The intelligence gathered from captured Vrexians allowed human forces to develop even more targeted weapons, and over the following weeks the Confederation watched as humans deployed biological agents that caused cascade failures in Vrexian immune systems and neural disruptors that severed hive mind connections and left individual Vrexians isolated and terrified and unable to coordinate. The Vrexian advance stopped and then reversed, and their forces began retreating toward their core territories, and the Overmind found itself fighting a war it did not understand against an enemy that seemed to know everything about Vrexian biology and psychology and weaknesses. But humans were not content with pushing the Vrexians back, and Admiral Chen made clear in strategic briefings that retreat was not an acceptable outcome, and the only acceptable outcome was complete elimination of Vrexian threat capacity. "We will pursue them to their home systems," Chen declared, "and we will destroy their breeding worlds and their genetic repositories and their industrial capacity. And we will reduce them to a population level that poses no future threat to anyone." "You mean extinction," said Elder Vrakamai. "Means sustainable threat reduction." Chen said, "If some Vrexians survive on isolated worlds with no ability to build ships or weapons, then that is acceptable, but any population that retains capacity for interstellar warfare must be eliminated." The Confederation Council met again to debate whether they should try to stop the humans, but they found themselves in an impossible position. Yes, human forces had saved them from certain destruction and taught their soldiers to survive, and shown them how to fight effectively, but had also demonstrated a ruthlessness that made peaceful species deeply uncomfortable. If we asked them to stop, they might leave, warned Strategic Director Kelmoth, and if they leave, the Vrexians will eventually rebuild and return, and next time we will face them alone. If we allow them to continue, we become complicit in genocide, countered Ambassador Thranks, and we lose any moral authority to call ourselves better than the monsters we fight.